This is the Way Podcast. If you want to know more about the Way Podcast, go to podcasttheway.com.
And this is FM 91.7, WHUS Stores at the top of the hour. Again, thank you, Don Grant, professional voice actor, for the new introduction. And be sure to go to the 3 Interesting Things podcast. He's a great guy. And yeah, be sure to do that. Now today, I'm sitting down with Martyn Clark, who wrote a book called Love Incorporated. Has a long history in the corporate world. And we're going to talk about that along with some changes and how to update it. And yeah, that's the intro. How you doing today, Martyn?
Good, thanks, Bill. I'm not so sure about that long history thing. It makes me sound really old.
Trying to stay young. How long? What's the history then? Like, how long have you been in it?
No, it is. No, it's quite long. 18 years I've been working in corporates. And ironically, like, it started off with voice stuff.
Like voice acting?
Voiceover. Well, I used to run a recording studio for voiceovers. And like, it was one of many things that I did, but it was all about trying to capture the voice in the most natural way possible. And we used it for all sorts of systems. And I ended up traveling the world, recording voices, and got in touch with a local company that was interested in how people come across, the presentation stuff. And we were talking about integrity and honesty and how that comes across in voices and how people can sound like they have more integrity.
Really?
And I was like baffled by this question, right? Or like, why would someone want to sound like they have more integrity rather than just having it? Because that would naturally follow, right? Yeah. But it was an interesting question. It got me really curious about what is it in the business world that had people wanting to sound like they had integrity rather than having it. And that's basically a quest that's lasted almost 20 years now. And that's pretty much what I do.
So your book and what you're kind of focusing on is how to find integrity in the workforce?
Well, no, it's more just about that question. Like, what is integrity? Does it matter? What can it be used for? Why do so many people want it on a surface level? But when it gets to the hard stuff, we kind of just ignore it. So what's that about in us as human beings? And how does that reflect in our systems? Why do we like our outsides matching our insides, but only so much? Because, like, if you go too far, then something bad might happen, or just interesting questions.
I would have to guess, if I had to take a swing at it, I would say something along trust or familiarity. People like to be in their box, stay nice and safe. So they want that trusting to sort of match that.
Right. So like we trust people who sound like they are, right?
Yeah.
And companies' money, getting the trust of clients is really big in business. So sounding like we're trustworthy, sounding like we're familiar is a thing that people seek after. Which is how we end up with adverts with all of these wonderful, trustworthy voices, right? For companies that are completely not trustworthy when you look underneath the surface. So we have this advertising that's like a surface layer that covers over what a company's actually like. And that really interests me.
Can people sort of fake act it? Like, I say that this is all interesting because that Don Grant, who's doing my introductions, he was a guest a few episodes ago. He was sort of like he did like a wacky voice, like, hey, tune into me or listen to this product. But after 9/11, he had to sort of become that soothing, calming, like literally like what you said, like get people to trust him, like come trust this, you're safe with this. And he's carried that out since. But in the workforce, do you have to just can people sort of fake that, or do you see people just trying to fake it, or do you have to actually be authentic to come across as authentic?
Can authenticity be fake? Well, yes, of course, authenticity can be fake, but it doesn't take much to push through it, right? So we have all of these brands. If I just think about like a tangible example of that, we have all these brands like, Family Farm Chicken.
Yeah.
And you pick it up and you're like, okay, that's $4 for a chicken. Like how Family Farm is that likely to be? But it's got this beautiful photo on the front of this guy with his chickens and the green rolling hills, and most people don't stop to question it, right? Yeah, exactly. Oh, this is sweet. I'll buy the Family Farm chicken. Where actually, when you get to the Family Farm chicken, it's actually, we squeeze them in as tight as we can and pack them high up to the ceiling to make as much money as possible. And we call it Family Farm because that sells well. So there's so far you can fake it, and that depends, I guess, on the curiosity of the audience, right? The more curious the audience, the more human the audience, the less likely you are to be able to fake it.
It's like, how deep is the audience really ready to dive down? I remember hearing like organic, maybe it wasn't organic or maybe GMO free, something like that. A lot of companies can just say they're organic or like farm free or something like that. But that's really just like a small, easy label. Like you really don't need much to actually accomplish that. Or you got companies like, I hope you don't have any ties with Lumber Liquidator. But my cousin's knows a lot about marketing and stuff. And I know they got thrown under a bus. She was telling me about maybe 8 years ago, and they've been trying to sort of rebrand themselves. And that also fed into how Burger King versus McDonald's, when they advertise, what was it? It was Burger King tries to go for like a fresh, like, oh, look, it's a good, healthy food, while McDonald's likes to go for like, oh, easy, budget friendly. And it's just interesting how they all have the different markets. So
I guess it is just a marketing thing, right? And marketing as a device has led to companies wanting to pretend more and more. So we've ended up with all these corporations who bring in specialists to pretend for them. Like they got no creativity in their own company, so they bring in a creative company to show the world how they really are, right? But how they really are isn't real. It's a mask. It's a front. And that's a revolution that is like coming like a tidal wave over the next few years. I'd say to corporations particularly, it's trendy to be authentic at the moment, which is kind of ironic because being authentic, well, like if you're really being authentic, it's not really very trendy at all.
Yeah,
it's not very cool. Yeah. Right. People will be like, oh, there's a genuine guy who talks about real stuff. That doesn't catch on. That's not stuff that people go home to talk about. It's what you get when you go up like wild mountain valleys to the end of the valley and you go past the farm and you go up to the hut and you meet the guy who cuts trees there all day long. You meet a guy who, he knows who he is. He knows how he thinks. He knows the valley inside out. And he's deeply connected to himself in that place. And, they're amazing, amazing people. But it's certainly not trendy to be that way. Because otherwise, we wouldn't all be clamoring for attention in cities, would we?
Yeah, what we see, like that whole, check out our authentic approach. You have to remember you're just getting the marketing of this major like business corporation, like all this money behind it. And right. Literally this whole other side, but you're only getting that specific team targeting to make you think that exact thing.
Yeah, right. Like there's a whole load of psychology in it as well. Real marketing psychology is big business. Yeah. Like designing messages so that they touch your market in exactly the right way, in the right place at the right time, so that they take action. And action in business is spending money, right? Yeah. There's a rebellious theme at the moment, which is, well, I'm going to be so authentic that I'm only going to use plywood to build things. It's like, well, plywood isn't exactly authentic, is it? It's just bits of old wood stuck together with glue. It doesn't have any real story behind it. It doesn't have substance behind it. So we're building this kind of fake authenticity as a new trend, which really interests me as well. So we've gone from really, really shallow marketing-led fake authenticity to something that's a little more authentic, but is equally fake. But it just looks more authentic. Yeah. And that's like, whoa, your head starts going.
And it could be good too if like they actually, I mean, I'm sure there's a few that are actually being authentic, but that seems like such a good trend. Like, hey, let's encourage these companies to be authentic. But then if you're gullible or if they're faking it, it's just, well, yeah, it's just like a good trend, but it's not actually paying off, it sounds like.
Well, it brings a really interesting question from me. You know, who am I to judge whether someone else is or another company is being authentic or not? Like, how do you actually judge that? And is that an okay thing to judge? How do I know what someone else is feeling or thinking?
Just your own perception. So, like, if you actually look into it,
Right.
I know, I know Spotify. Their Apple wanted to take them off their app store like a year ago, and Spotify and a few other companies started taking the approach. I saw in newspaper, but they're trying to say, "Oh, Apple's the big business. Help us take on the big business." They're trying to take us down from their app store. But then, I mean, I love Spotify. I use Spotify, but
Yeah.
I know they're another big corporate. Like you look into their background, and they own a bunch of other companies. They could lose Spotify and they'll be fine. They shouldn't lose Spotify, but like they're still very well off. They're just trying to do this underground, we're with you, the people kind of approach.
Right. I like a bit like the Facebook thing, like we're your friends.
Yeah, exactly.
You might have been at some stage, you know, when there are 20 of you in a basement in wherever it was Harvard. You know, when it was a small group of people working together, then yes, it was a friendly little company. But the moment you have billions of customers, you're in a different ballpark, and you are all about money under the current structures.
Then there's other things like Whole Foods or some of those other companies, Stop and Shop. When you purchase your order, they're like, "Hey, would you like to donate $1 to this charity?" I'm like, "Oh yeah, it's only $1. I want to donate. That sounds great. Why not?" But then I found out they do this because it gives them a tax credit loophole. So they take those extra donations from the people, donate it themselves, and then they get a tax break.
Wow. Do you know that goes back to that thing, right, where I said if you ask too many questions, you'll see behind the quote authenticity really quickly. Whoa. And that's the case in the vast majority of our system, right? I ended up just asking these questions, right? I was working with executives very quickly, and asking simple questions like, okay, this message that you're speaking, it sounds like you don't really mean it. What is it you actually mean? When you ask like 2 or 3 of these questions in a row, like what is it you actually mean, and what stops you from saying that, and how would your customers react if you said that? And when it comes down to it, people don't like having their money taken unless they're getting something in return that they really actually value, and then they're willing to pay. They're willing to pay generously. So it comes down to the values match. You know, what matters to me as a person, and what matters to the company, and can we find a match? And the old way of doing things is essentially to try to mislead people into buying stuff, as much stuff as possible, as fast as possible, so they don't notice what they're buying, and if it breaks in a month, they buy another one. So this whole system that we've built around misleading and around trying to sell as much as possible, as fast as possible, and trying to mislead people so they don't ask those questions that go a little below the surface.
Buying things and they break down the road. I remember again, like, I was listening to a podcast. I forgot which one, maybe Science Versus, but like refrigerators, stuff like that, they're literally built to break 5 to 10 years. Like that saying, these things aren't built like they're used to. So like refrigerators and stuff like that, they're literally built so they fall apart. So people have to go back down the road to buy it again and spend more money.
Yeah, there's a reason I tend to buy things from the 70s.
There you go.
I tend to buy things from the 70s and refurbish them because I know they'll last for another 50 years because there's none of the disposable plastic parts in them, and everything is easily repaired. Yeah. But that's ultimately a system of trade that at its core lacks integrity.
I guess so.
That we've allowed to develop and we've encouraged to develop because fundamentally it's been a benefit to society to do so. you think in the last 100 years, we've gone from the average person dying age 40, 45, the average worker, to now living into their 70s, because we've been gradually raising the standard of living. So what we've done is sacrifice quality so that everyone can have a more even quality of life. So that's no bad thing, right? We've raised the bottom in the lower ends. Like I was looking at the average lifespan, and I have reached. What age am I? 49. I've reached the limit that 100 years ago my great grandparents would have died at. I'm like, whoa! Like I don't feel like I've had my the life I'm owed yet. In quotes.
And that's good. I love
it's
that
amazing.
we're all healthy and like living longer. While researching, like to prepare, one of the things since 1973 is one of the issues with the corporate, with how everything's paying out, is there's been a large wage stagnation. So, for example, productivity has grown 74%, but the hourly compensation is 9.2%. And this can be seen like this is America, but the EU as a total is about from 2000 to 2016, it's a productivity 10%, wages, it's a graph, so I can't see the exact number, but it's like 2%. And there's just a lot of this productivity going up and wages not really growing as much. So why?
Basically, productivity has boomed while wages in relative terms have stayed completely stagnant, right?
Exactly. So everyone's sort of becoming overworked, but
this is in the entire time that I've been alive. We've gone from one person being able to make enough money to support a family to needing two people now to work like more than full time to be able to do it.
So even then have a house, and even then, like, it's still not, you're still not
to me, it's related to this whole idea of progress, that progress equals improving efficiency, because we have built a capitalist system that requires exponential growth in order to keep going. And that's just a fallacy, right? I studied physics. One of the early things you learn in physics is what exponential growth is. Like if you stick bacteria in a dish and you feed them jam or something that's high in energy, they'll grow. The population will grow exponentially, right? Yeah, and it'll grow exponentially while it has enough jam or whatever it is it's eating. And sooner or later, you get to the point where you either reach the edge of the container or the limits of the food, or they just grew too fast, and you reach a limit in which the system can no longer grow exponentially, because we live in a physical world that has limits, right? So exponential growth will always hit a limit of some kind.
What do you think that limit is, like in the work world?
Well, right now we're hitting the limits of how efficiently people can operate. Like, can we pay attention to WhatsApp and Facebook and Twitter and our email and Instagram at the same time, while doing our accounts on our phone, while talking to someone while in a meeting on Zoom? We're reaching the limits of efficiency there. You're reaching the limits of efficiency in terms of how systems work. Like you don't get more efficient than live accountancy. We're hitting limits in terms of the physical parameters of the world, like how many people we can fit in a city, how many cities we can fit in a country, how many people we can fit in a continent before the pollution kills everyone, how many cars we can have on a road before we run out of oil. Like just about every single limit we're hitting right now, or will be hitting in the next 20, 30 years. Of course, there's some good news, though, which is by 2050, we will have reached peak population on the Earth of around 10 billion. So we've reached the population limit, and beyond that, population is likely to stay static or decline for a while. But we have a problem. We're using 5 times the amount of energy that we need to use to be able to sustainably keep that population without causing extreme damage to the environment. So it's like we're hitting every single possible limit. But what we're not really doing is changing the system. We're tweaking it. We're doing like that giving to charity stuff. We're doing tiny little bits around the edges where we offset carbon, or we change little bits and pieces here and there that might save 20%, 30%, but actually saving 20% or 30% is not the same as reducing by a fifth the amount of energy we use. Gotcha. That's a giant thing.
Yeah, big fear was overpopulation, but it's good that it actually will likely stagnate 2050, and it already is in developed countries. It's not exponential anymore. Like, we're not worried about that as much. But you want to say, I guess, what kind of change do you want to see with like the system as a whole? Like, I know we need some climate change action for like those issues, but for like wages, corporate world, or even like capitalism, how what changes would you like to see?
Well, there's a core issue basically that we've built a system which is about taking and using and dominating and crushing and winning and destroying, and everything in the system is about that. So we become more efficient at extracting stuff from the ground. We become more efficient at using oil, become more efficient at everything. And we've basically forgotten the flip side. Like, the two sides is it's fine to go out in the world and create something, by taking things and making something with it. But we also need to give back somehow. And giving back involves like a really deep sense of responsibility and a sense of caring about the impact of what we're doing. And currently business calls that externalities. So when you see a business plan, they'll look at, what do we need? We need 10,000 people. We need 20 billion gallons of oil or whatever. And they look at the location and they find their place to put the business. And then they're like, well, what do we do about the environmental impact? Well, that's an externality. That's outside of our direct control. So when a business relocates, they don't take the secondary consequences into account. So they'll mostly try to follow the laws. They'll try to fit in the constraints of local government, of national, international law. But they will not spend any time looking at secondary consequences. I've ended up working in businesses, for example, where for a whole generation, people were employed by this one company. And because it became less efficient to continue to manufacture in that location, costs rose, profits dropped. They wanted the business to carry on existing, so they just closed the plants. And what you end up with is then a generation of unemployed people, a generation of sick people, a generation of kids who don't have enough food, a generation of people, 20 years later who don't have good education, and wreaking complete havoc in a community simply because it doesn't make enough money anymore. So the only tipping point in decision making in terms of how we have structured our companies is whether they make enough money or not. And then that goes back to the foundation of corporations, the foundation, the legal foundation of how corporations are put together, which is basically the responsibility of the directors is for the benefit of the corporation, and that's all. And corporations exist to make money for the shareholders. So you have a legal basis of corporations that says that the directors cannot act in any way that doesn't make money for shareholders without the shareholders' consent. And of course, no one goes seeking shareholders' consent to do something that doesn't make money. So we have that whole structure in place that supports decisions that are only about money and ignore the impact, whether the impact internally on the workforce, the impact on other businesses, the impact on other countries, on other locations. They're just not taken into account. So when you have the directors talking to politicians about what needs to happen and large corporations are very powerful in politics. They always sway towards money, not benefit to community, not benefit to the future, not what sort of system are we building, but it's always about how do we work more efficiently to make more money. So I'm looking at like how do we actually pick apart the very core legal foundations on which corporations are built, to make sure that there's actual responsibility woven into them of whatever kind that people want to take, right? But if we can build corporations that have responsibility woven in right from the beginning, legally, right at the core, instead of added on to the side, then we can start building a new system. It'll take years, it'll take decades, but that's the notion that I've been playing with, exploring, looking at, wanting to do with my own company.
So restrictions or having the government say, hey, you can't step out of line too much, you need to...
See, I'm not big on control. I would say that it would make sense to have some kind of monitoring of companies to say, look, you have to have a purpose that isn't just about money. We will audit. You tell us what your purpose is. What are you good for? What's the positive thing you're doing in the world? And we'll check in to check that you're actually doing that you're not just taking.
Can always do like incentives, like tax breaks too, stuff like that.
Right.
Well, first, actually, a quick sidetrack so the audience knows you're where you're coming from. You've worked as a board of directors for companies. Do you mind sharing?
No, that's good. Yeah, I've worked at board level across many large corporations around the world, advising, guiding, irritating, asking all the questions that poke holes in who they say they are.
So I just wanted to apply some ethos quickly off to the side, but it makes it just makes sense, sort of. You have a company, and the company needs money to stay successful, and the more money it gets, the better off the people are in the company because you gain more money off, you're living better off. So you want to get the most resources you can. You want to save as much money as you can, take as many cuts as you can, and just do whatever you want to have sort of the most money with the company. That's how it operates. That's the primary goal, I feel like.
Yeah.
And also, quick sidetrack, I love that bit with the politics and how they're definitely involved there. But yeah, it sort of makes sense that you have this. And I feel like down the road, you're seeing it with, say, Apple, you're seeing it with Disney, you're seeing it where they grow stronger and stronger. So what do? You buy another company, and that way you have more power, more control in the market. And it just seems like it's sort of, there's restrictions to stop pure monopolies, but it feels like it's just this continuous build to like one company with like all the power.
Megacorp.
Yeah, the megacorp.
It's a bit like WALL-E, the Pixar movie. Is it Disney Pixar? I don't remember.
I think it's Pixar.
Anyway.
I mean, they're the same.
Or basically, one corporation runs everything. One corporation runs everything, and everyone's sent off the planet because it's too polluted. That's essentially where we are actually headed. Oh. And there's some laws that are working against it, but it's not laws. The laws aren't the answer. What we need is a willingness to self-police, to actually say, do you know what? This way of being, this way of doing, this way of putting profit above everything else, that just isn't right. Just isn't right. We don't need to become goody two-shoes, right? I've got no problem with making money. I have no problem with running organizations that are profitable. I have no interest in running charities. But I do believe that if you have power, you have a responsibility to exercise that power responsibly. And that responsibility is very, very deep, the more power you have. And I sat with this during the crash almost. When was that? Oh, it's 12 years ago.
2008, yeah.
Yeah. Sat with this in the crash because I was working with boards in global banks at the time. And I was sitting thinking, okay, and how do they decide where to put the line? Like, you can repossess anyone's house right now. We'll get there again in 3 or 4 years' time. But at the time, there were markets in which 40, 50% of the mortgages that people held didn't have enough money to pay off the house purchase. So they were negative equity, and the bank could have taken all the houses, and they had to put the line somewhere, like who do you repossess and who do you not? Like how have we even built a system where there's so much money, so much capacity, so much ability to create wealth, and we can take people's homes from them? I don't like the idea of that. Like just as a basic principle, I don't like the idea of that. Like how have we made it okay for people to basically gamble their own safety to that extent? Is that okay? And I'm more interested in the conversation about it and trying out different new things. How could we structure that differently? How can we be more careful? How can we be more caring? How could we tell people in the first place, do you know what? I understand you'd really like to have a giant house, but how are you going to pay for that? You know, I know you're going to be able to pay for it maybe for the next 3 years, but you know, things don't always go up. But we built this system that's got this delusion at the heart of it, which is about exponential growth. And it's just wrong, right? It's wrong from a physics perspective. It's wrong from a moral perspective. It's wrong from it's just wrong. Whatever way you pick it apart, it makes no sense. But these are the unspoken questions that people are unwilling to ask and unwilling to talk about.
Building off of that housing, I have a stat that 40% of Americans have trouble paying for food, medical care, housing, or utilities in the last year. And nearly half of Americans have no retirement savings, creating increases in a lot of stress-related illnesses and diseases. That's like a consequence, but 4 out of 10 Americans have side hustles to make more money to help make ends meet. So I just want to just add on to that to show it's that's nearly half or 40%.
It's so scary, isn't it?
Yeah. How in your book you mentioned it a bit, but how do you want to bring a more humane side to this workforce? Because again, like a corporate, or a company, it just makes sense. You want to save money, you want to be efficient, you want pure efficiency. So how do you bring a humane sort of structure to it and change
I think it really starts
environment?
It starts with how we see leadership and power in society, right? Yeah. Where we see power as being about getting and about taking and about building giant buildings and empires, we're going to end up with assholes in charge. We're going to end up with people in charge who don't know how to take responsibility, don't want to take responsibility, who are just in it for them. And when there are negotiations that need to happen, and when there's difficult, long-term consequences that need to be taken into account, they're just going to choose whatever benefits them in the short term. So we've basically allowed and encouraged over the last, it's in that period, isn't it? Since the 1970s, exponential growth, since credit became a big thing, right? It was all led by financial services. We have more and more people in charge of organizations who are only about driving this exponential growth. Because if you don't, what happens? Someone else is going to buy your company. But someone else is going to get that loan.
But your company, I understand that, but your company, or what kind of approaches do you want to take to fix that, to go against that? What should these people be doing?
See, well, all I know is what I would do, right, or what I'd like to do. So we're planning to raise investment to start a new kind of corporation to pilot these ideas, right? Just to see what might work, what ways we can work things. And if you think about that simple thing, how do you make sure that the people who work in your organization are doing okay? The answer is by asking them, and by actually listening, and caring. And there are a couple of corporations, a couple of large organizations that have done this, that have said, you know what, we want everyone to have an actual living wage. And by that, we mean a wage that allows them to not worry about where their food is coming from.
Yeah.
And it I mean, it sounds like such a simple thing, but it does involve having difficult conversations, right? You know, watching carefully and listening and actually knowing your people. And one of the first things, you know, if anyone who's worked in a large business will know, is that you can't care for your people if there are too many, because you can't know them. Because we can only really know 100 people or 100, and I can't remember what the number is. There's a specific number that is basically the largest community that we can get a sense of. So our businesses need to be structured in a way that involves community at the heart. And those communities need to be human scaled. So business can't really have more than 100, 150 people in them. So what's that mean if you want to build a large or influential business? Well, you've got to split it into lots of tiny little businesses. So that's where we need to get clever with central systems that allow us to build the scale that we need, because we do need scale now, right? We're living in a globalized system where if we don't have scale, everything falls apart. So we have to find a new way of doing scale. And the only way to keep that sort of sense of humanness, which is, you know, I know that this person is struggling to pay the bills because I know them, right?
Yeah.
Because we spend time together outside of work, because we are friends. And the only way to do that is to build the structures of the organization and the support systems within the organization so that it's possible for you to have many of these small businesses working together, collaborating together on a platform, so that people actually know each other, but are part of something bigger as well. So that's part of the structure I'd like to put in place, is platforms that allow essentially, let's say, 50 small businesses to work together really effectively while keeping their own individual flavor, but working together as efficiently, as effectively as an equivalent sized corporation would. Because then you have those relationships, and those relationships become the means of caring for each other. And then you have basic principles surrounding that, which are, you know what, in the businesses that are part of this, it would end up being a big conglomerate, right? In the businesses that are part of this, we believe that it's important to respect the individual's needs, basic needs in life, and to ensure that no one's in the position where they're worrying about their health to the extent that they don't go to seek help because they're worried about how much it's going to cost. That's just not okay, right? We don't need to live like that anymore. We have all of the capacities for no one in the world to ever need to live like that.
Definitely. Over in Connecticut, we have companies called Collins Aerospace and Pratt and Whitney.
Mhm.
They just got bought out too, but if you ask somebody who worked there 50 years ago, they would say it was sort of this chaotic, overpopulated sort of you're an ant in the mass. But what they decided to do was sort of, nowadays the offices are smaller. There's more rooms and stuff. So you're not surrounded by, say, 100 people. You're surrounded by, say, 30 people. And even though they have those same numbers, they're still, you're more categorized. You're in your own teams and you're able to get closer with your coworkers or even your boss. Or, I mean, that's another thing too, that I feel like there's an old mentality. I'm not as old as other people, but I know it was sort of, don't talk to your boss, don't come to them with problems or something, just do the job. But now they're being told to be more accepting, be more, oh, come here, I'll help you out. I'm still your boss. I'm not, like, you still have to follow the job, but be open to what's the problem with the workforce, or more open to issues these employees have.
Yeah. Well, I guess that's a good example of the changes that I'm talking about, which are essentially leading businesses in a way that doesn't put the profit first above everything else. Like, profit needs to be on the on the roadmap. It absolutely has to be for the capacity of organizations to grow or expand or continue. But actually, there's nothing wrong with businesses dying. And this is another part of the fallacy, right? This idea that exponential growth, we should be able to continue to grow indefinitely, and businesses shouldn't die. Those are like two assumptions in capitalism. It's a really stupid idea. Like, businesses are just like people. They're limited in their scope. They will always come to the stage where they're no longer relevant. Their time just comes, and they need to be let go of. But we don't have a process for that. We don't have an idea that businesses have a shelf life. So this idea of actually creating businesses with that end in mind, that it's a temporary thing that we're creating. We can find joy in it. We can find friendship, companionship, and make money. And when its time is done, we just need to let go and move on to something new. I think these are all new concepts that we need to find ways to work into a new system. So we've moved from an environment where a job for life was normal to, like, I'm just shocked by the contracts that I'm seeing given out to, particularly to younger people, like in their early 20s, who were given 0 hours contracts with no rights to healthcare, with no rights to anything. So they're not guaranteed any work. From one week to the next, they can go from having enough work to having nothing, and then enough again. And like we've gone from one extreme to another, and we need to find somewhere in between, to be able to say to people, we got work here for a while. We don't know how long it's going to last. And have those genuine conversations with people. And I think that genuineness, that integrity is it's at the core of my vision for how businesses could become. Right? We can have the difficult conversations about, well, what's the environmental impact? Have the difficult conversations about, well, how do we make sure everyone can have a basic level of quality of life? And how do we do that together? There's no right answer. How do we structure the business? How do create a container, right? Each business is like a legal container. How do we create a container that actually does some good in the world?
I know of a company that might be in the opposite direction. You've heard of a small company called Amazon, right? Little one.
Yes.
Yeah. There's
the lockdown providers.
The lockdown providers, exactly. They're booming because it makes sense. Somebody wants to go out in public. Mm-hmm. But there's a few case studies with them where I've heard like bad things about them in the past, but then I found what they'll do is people will come to them with issues, or say employee who had vision issues. She wanted to have these yellow bright painted lines or these other things to sort of help her out because there's been a lot of injuries with the company. So here's an example. She applies saying, hey, can we implement some small changes? And in the report, there's been no real changes there. Still a lot of injuries. And there's just a lot of, I'm trying to read this report as I speak, but so it's just like this guy, Jim Pat Lacewell. He started working at Amazon in Staten Island in November. But after 3 days, he quit because he said it reminded him of prison. And to put it lightly, it's like, okay. But there's just a bunch of these where there's that. They have computer chips in, I don't know if on the devices they use or on them themselves. I know they have cameras on all the employees at all times. They have these devices that monitor them. So if they're not moving enough boxes, or if they're not working hard enough in an amount of time, the machine will will track them, give a little alert, and they get repercussions. They could even be fired if, again, they don't do a good enough job.
But Amazon, I mean, that methodology, let's say, is the ultimate output of consumerist capitalism. Yeah. That is when you believe that the only way to get anywhere is continuous exponential growth, then you're just going to squeeze people harder and harder and harder until you fire them, right? You're going to fire them and replace them with robots. Yeah. And then you'll fire the finance director and replace him by a robot. And and we'll end up with, companies that are 90% robotic, and things will turn up on time. I mean, it's not necessarily a bad thing. This is part of, like, the impact is really bad for the employees. It's bad for the individuals involved. But what we're doing is creating systems that are becoming more and more efficient, which means that theoretically, we should be able to hand over a lot of our work to these machines to do, right? Which gives us more time for caring about each other. But instead, what happens is the productivity gets skimmed off as money for investors. So the rich become richer, and we're all running around after the machines faster and faster over time. So the average person is run off their feet, has no time to sit and read bedtime stories to their kids anymore. While the rich become richer, and we're losing quality of life in a spiritual sense and an emotional sense. We're gaining quality of life in healthcare and in other ways, but we're losing it at a very fundamental human level. And that's the ultimate impact that our system is having, where we're killing off our own culture, our own ways of being, what it means to be human. And we have to change that. We have to change it. And that is, at the moment, that change lies in the hands of corporate directors and shareholders, actually, and in the hands of the billionaires who are currently, many of them, just giving their money away because they're earning so much they don't know what to do with it.
Since 1980, the bottom 50% of people have lost about $500 billion, while the top 0.01, top one of those gained $2.1 trillion or $2.7 trillion. I know for a fact it's one of those numbers. I just don't know which ones, but like $1 trillion. And since this COVID epidemic began over the past year, again, just look at Elon Musk, for example. They've been gaining billions and billions while, again, we're in like an epidemic.
It's interesting, like yesterday I was in Side in Turkey walking. I was the day before yesterday, I was in Side walking by the Apollo temple that is it's around 2,000 years old, or maybe 3,000 actually. Anyway, it's a temple to the sun god. And there are inscriptions in the temples. And one of the inscriptions, I was like, what does that actually mean? I looked it up and was reading about it. Surety breeds destruction. And I was like, is that about being sure about it? Is that about certainty? Do we have to keep open minds? And I read further about it. Surety is a term for indebtedness in the ancient world, where you could take on a personal debt and sign your life over if you couldn't repay it, or the life of one of your kids. And I was like, what? So in the ancient world, you could take on a debt, lose your job, and then your kid gets taken away into slavery. I'm like, wow, we still have the same system, don't we? We've not changed this. We have whole families being turned to slavery, whole communities being turned to slavery. Not in a, like, it's, we have a lot of freedom, but the average person doesn't know what they're getting into, doesn't know the consequences, and work their whole life now for very little sense of meaning, moving boxes for Amazon or whoever it is you're moving boxes for. And that to me is the question, how do we change that? And how do we change that in little, it doesn't need to be big ways to make a very big difference to people. But if we do lots of little things across the whole system, we can really radically change how a system works. But ultimately, there are legal and structural changes that need to be put in place that no one wants to talk about. Yeah. And the reason no one wants to talk about it is because the people who are in charge have vested interest in it staying that way. And back in the ancient world, business owners, when they had debts they couldn't repay, nothing happened. They kept their status, they just lost the business, right? Yeah. And that's still how it works for business owners. You can have a debt, it just gets written off, the company goes bankrupt, you have to pay for your shares in the company and nothing else. You take on a small responsibility, but you can you don't really need to repay much. And then the way directors get around it is they tend to create shell companies, so companies that own companies that own companies that own companies, so that when they all collapse, they have nothing to pay. And this, stratification in the system, the people who know the legal system and how it works, and the people who don't know the legal system and how it works, you've got masters and slaves. It's just a different way of having masters and slaves. And until we start really digging into how that works, like how we fundamentally structure society, until the people who have the power aren't abusing that power to get themselves money and status, things really won't change at the fundamental level that we need them to in the next 30 years to combat these system limits that we're reaching. That's the challenge, right? Nobody wants these things to change. And what are we going to do? We wait until the system completely collapses? I'm not keen on seeing that. That would breed destruction at a level that is extreme.
Yeah, we actually have to, change it.
And COVID is really surfacing some of the changes that are necessary, right?
That's true. I mean, if
really
there's a time for change, I feel like this is the time.
Mm-hmm. There's a reason, like I wrote this book 1.5 years ago, and I was just waiting for the right time to release it. I was about to release it right before COVID, so in February of last year, and had all these wonderful plans of starting groups all around the world and flying around, and then COVID arrived, and with it lockdown here in Italy, I was in the area where COVID first spread. So we were in lockdown for something like 16 weeks, unable to leave, do anything, go anywhere. I just walked in the garden.
Real bad, yeah.
Yeah. So I just waited until that wave went past because people were talking about more human things. And I saw like policies changing with insurance and policies changing in banks about repayment of loans and repayment of mortgages. And there's a little more humanity just gradually seeping in. And I thought, I'll wait until this first wave is over, until we're looking at the future and know a little bit about what we're heading into. The answer is just more of the same.
Yeah.
More of the same, and there's no plan on how to deal with it.
Because people don't really want to change too much. We should change, but it's just taking the steps to actually change. That's like actual work.
There's a quote from a movie. I forget what movie it was. At the precipice, we change. It's always stuck with me, which is the idea that no one really changes unless they have to.
Oh, I feel like that's familiar.
The Day the Earth Stood Still is the movie.
Yep. I remember that.
Thank you, Google. See, I'm so dependent on corporations here. It's like, my book is released on Amazon, Love Incorporated. And here I am looking up on Google while complaining about corporations and how they work.
I mean,
but the reality is we don't need rid of them. We need to find a way to live more humanly with them, to have higher expectations of them.
They're a good thing. We just need them to work better, be better structured.
It'll be a structure that reflects humanity better, instead of what accountants' dream worlds look like.
Sounds good. Well, I think we're about an hour in. Thank you very much for coming out to the show.
Oh, you're welcome. Thank you, Bill.
Is there any other final message you want to tell the audience? Any final point?
Yeah, it's a really interesting one. I'm torn on. It's like, I'd like to talk to you. That's it. I'd like to talk to you. The end of my book is like an invitation. Maybe I can just read it. I want this book to be a beginning, a starting point, a new chapter for everyone who reads it. I want to start a movement. I want Gadfly, that's my company, while it exists, to be an organization that moves the world emotionally, spiritually, and existentially. I want us all to remember what really matters in life, beyond money, beyond consumption, and beyond profit. So the idea of starting a conversation, and the way to do that is to talk.
Sounds good. So start the discussion.
Like
we just did here, had a discussion.
Exactly.
And this has been FM 91.7 WHUS Stores at the top of the hour. Well, again, Martyn Clark. For anybody listening, in the description, you'll see a link for his book, Love Incorporated. Yeah, thanks for coming out again.
Thank you.
This has been The Way Podcast. If you want to know more about The Way Podcast, go to podcasttheway.com.
And as always, deuces.